Time and again, the world bears witness to truths seldom said. Lend an ear. We promise enlightened, informed conversation. My name is Robert, and this is Seldom Said, the place where conversation matters. Special guest today, Alex Merced, the Vice Chairperson of the Libertarian National Committee. Welcome to Seldom Said, Alex.
Thank you for having me on, Bob. It's a pleasure to be on.
It's our pleasure, I can assure you. I wonder if we can start with a little bit of personal background, who you are, where you've been, and what's brought you to this time and place.
Gotcha. So, again, the name's Alex Merced. During the day, I'm a financial instructor. I train people in the financial industry to get their licenses, sales training, professional training. But in my free time, I've been a very passionate political activist ever since 2007. Really was the 2007-2008 election, specifically Ron Paul, that kind of really got me interested. It's actually a really interesting story that involves me traveling to the Philippines and whatnot, which I detail in a video called the Aspirational Libertarian. But basically from there, I got really involved in just creating sort of media to educate people on economics and philosophy. And then it was in 2013 when I was actually recruited to be the public advocate candidate in New York City, where I was the top vote getter in 2013 for the citywide election for the Libertarian Party. And then I ran again in 2016 as the U.S. Senate candidate for New York, where I ran against Chuck Schumer, and my vote total was the second highest vote total for a U.S. Senate race for the Libertarian Party in New York. And then I ran one more time in 2017 for NYC Comptroller, where out of the citywide candidates, I was the one candidate that actually had an increase for that office versus the 2013 race. So with all that experience in running for office, I wanted to kind of start playing more of a support role for candidates. So I ran for vice chair earlier this year, traveled the country, got to meet a lot of libertarian delegates. And in New Orleans in July, I won with among 5 candidates the vice chairmanship of the Libertarian National Committee, and I've just been working to support candidates and just help grow the party so that way we move things in the right direction.
Interesting terminology. You use the phrase aspirational libertarian. That carries an elemental definition of hope, but also the pragmatic nature of wanting to be in power. Can you define the term for the listening audience?
Oh, yes. It's actually a big part of sort of my mantra that basically to create sort of a more libertarian world or a more liberal world where people have more autonomy over their life and whatnot, you don't have to just empower people by giving them sort of the legal ability to do things, but you also have to inspire them to do the great things that they can do. And one of the ways you can do that is by living the best life you can. And because a lot of libertarians, they focus on advocating by just saying, hey, this is the argument, this is the logical case. Isn't it? It's so logically consistent, how can you not agree with it? But not everyone necessarily thinks about everything in sort of a grand logical system. But people do see people who are successful, who are healthy, who are kind, and say, you know what, I'd like to aspire to be that way. And if they aspire to the way you live your life, they'll oftentimes also aspire to your values. So I'm constantly preaching the idea of being that aspirational libertarian, living the best life you can, and other people will sort of kind of start liking your ideas because you're such a great example of that. So leading by example.
Interesting. Can you ascribe to a moment in your own personal life, professional and personal, where in point of fact you had this epiphanal feeling that indeed this is what you wanted to do with your life?
Let's see. Far as like just pursuing sort of a more free world, definitely the 2007-2008 election, just sort of the whole Ron Paul moment really kind of awoke a very passion in me. Like before that, really my passion was music, and I used to play guitar, sing, produce electronic music, which I still do for fun. But my passion really shifted towards the sort of ideal of increasing people's autonomy, of giving people more opportunities to be happy. And that basically became my mission since that moment, because for the first moment I could understand sort of, in the first couple of years after 2008, I really spent a lot of time more secluded, learning philosophy and history to fully kind of come to grips with sort of this new passion. But once you kind of see how human incentive and all these different things kind of connect with each other, there's nothing more exciting than seeing people kind of reach their potential and wanting to help them reach that potential.
As a person who's enamored with music, as many of us are, do you consider politics, just as music is, should be judged as an art form?
Very much, very much. Because at the end of the day, it's expression. And when you're creating a song, and I think it's part of what appeals to me. I've always been into very creative endeavors and very into expressing myself. And whether it's in music or in politics, I'm trying to express myself to create a situation in which people are better off. I try to create music that people enjoy and feel better. Through politics, I try to express myself in a way that might change not just policy, but also change the way people may decide to live their lives for them to have a better life, to inspire them to their own potential. And to me, that ability to express myself and create change is something that's very, very tangible, very, very exciting and appealing to me.
You mentioned Ron Paul. I do remember a couple of years back walking across a major Ivy campus and finding that a large percentage of the students were much taken by the fact that he would visit. What is there about the man, his policy, his demeanor, and his expression that drew you to him?
I think that what drew me to Ron Paul is very much the same thing that drew a lot of people to Bernie Sanders. This is actually something else I talk about when I usually do my aspirational libertarian talk, that even though they were, of older age, basically they were exciting to young people because they showed something that young people want to believe, that you can stay idealistic, that you don't have to become cynical as you get older. And they lived a life where they stayed consistent to their values. They lived good lives, trying to be good people. And that's kind of when, especially in those early days when your idealism at its peak, to see an example of how you can actually hold on to that is very exciting. It shows you that the world doesn't have to break you down at some point. And that, to me, I think is why they appeal so much to a younger demographic.
How important would you feel the personal ethos of the person is, Ron Paul, Bernie Sanders, if they're going to be one and the same in the matter of political expression or the manners in which they proceed? Do you feel that alone is enough?
Can you elaborate on that question?
Most certainly. How important is it to have a methodological process, saying pedantically what you want and how you want to get it? And how important, if not equally so, is the ability to make people feel that you're enamored with their being there, with their embracing your views?
I think it's always a little bit of both. Bottom line is, if people don't like you, they're not going to hear you. And that's one of the things, the kind of steps that Ron Paul would take, and people on campuses, being with the people that allow people to be open to listening to them, open to the ideas and liking them. But the thing is that once people like you, it's also very important what you say afterwards, because what you say afterwards, what people end up embracing, has real life consequences in the world around them, and the decisions and how they view their life and how they view the challenges in their life. Whether they view whether their challenges are surmountable or insurmountable, and that's basically, so it matters to be liked. It matters to connect with people, but it also matters what comes up afterwards. But one can't really happen without the other.
It's interesting. One would wonder whether we've reached an age where Hollywood is running candidates and people are playing a role. Have you grown somewhat cynical about the normalized process as it appears?
Yes and no. Of course, we would all love this sort of ideal where everybody kind of is constantly civically involved and looking into every candidate in every race. But to me, it's totally rational. It's kind of like Dr. Kaplan's book, The Myth of the Rational Voter, where people have lives, they have work, they have family, they have their own challenges in their life. So it's understandable kind of how basically kind of politics gets dominated by sound bites and whatnot. But that's kind of why I find this particular time exciting, because more than I've seen in a long time, the last few years, with all the volatility there's been in politics, it suddenly made people on all sides much, I would say, less apathetic and much more caring about what's going on. That hasn't necessarily yielded in sort of a availability of perfect information or seeking of perfect information. but people are suddenly caring about the process again. And even if that yields some volatility in the short run, I think we'll on the other end of that volatility, we'll have something that at least is a step in the right direction.
Many who are critical of libertarianism would argue that it's too revolutionary. Do you consider yourself a revolutionary, Alex?
Yeah, I do think the core libertarianism, it's basically a universal peace, not just peace between nations, but peace between individuals, peace between collectives of individuals. It's sort of a massive revolutionary, or really not revolutionary, evolutionary level of peace. Because you're not asking people to revolt. You're asking people to do quite the opposite, to sort of denounce the idea of compelling others, of using violence against others, in a very massive way. To me, that's more of an evolution than a revolution, because I don't always just find the term revolution to always have oftentimes a more connotation of force and pushing back. This is more of a sort of universal disarmament of individuals to choose to coexist with each other and their differences.
Again, I'm playing devil's advocate more than anything else. I tend to try to research a guest before I do it in his philosophy. For those who would argue that there is a humane type of naivete ascribed to such feelings, that we're all going to be different, we're all going to have our own corners, and we're all going to stay there in times of stress. How would you respond?
Say that again?
There are those who would take the position that one is what they are, and reaching out is nice, but after the few minutes of acclamation, I'm returning back to what I understand best. How do you equate that?
Of course. I mean, all political ideology at its root has ideals that can oftentimes come off as naive, because you're expecting the whole world to you're expecting sort of a consensus towards a particular direction in the world. And consensus are never perfectly in any direction, but ideals are important to have because they give you direction. So the example I always use when people sort of criticize the idea of having sort of a perfect libertarian ideal, I try to talk about the idea of ideals in general. So like if I were to work out, I could imagine sort of a perfect physical self that's ripped and muscular and lean. Now, more than likely, I'm probably not going to reach that ideal, but by focusing that ideal, it gives me a direction so that way I can get closer to it. So by having that sort of a radically peaceful, individualistic ideal, I hope that maybe that we get there and that's possible, but at least we'll get somewhere close because it's part of the conversation. So I understand the criticism of ideals and utopian ideals, but I do think they serve a purpose in giving people direction, whatever direction that their ideals are in.
Now, we're within 5 minutes of our first station break. I'll give you a 30-second lead before we take it. But I'm wondering if you can give us a synopsis in précis form of the Libertarian Party itself. Who are they? Where did they come from?
So the Libertarian Party was formed back in 1971, and we're basically here to have a libertarian voice in the political process. That is basically is unabashedly libertarian. That is unabashedly pushing libertarian policy reforms, candidates, ballot referendums, and trying to push that world of a greater individual peace.
You mentioned Ron Paul, Bernie Sanders, persons of their ilk. Did you tend to, at some stage in your life, Alex, have a courtship with different philosophies because of the individual?
Yes. I mean, before Ron Paul and I became libertarian, I was actually a very hard left progressive for a period of time. Before that, and it all came from that same place of just wanting people to be able to have better lives and better opportunities and whatnot. The difference is just as my understanding of the means to get there has changed over time. My political ends have changed over time, but my interpersonal or my social ends of making people's lives better has not changed at all.
If I were to click my heels and judge where you'd like the country to be in 10 years, can you espouse a dream and place it in context?
An ideal world, basically, you have a world where you have much more autonomy and enterprise and charity and in our individual relationships. That would generally lead to a lot of positive trends, like a lower cost of living, more peace around the world. that would generally lead to more positive outcomes, more positive opportunities. So I would love to get there, or as close to there as possible, within the next 10 years, or within any time frame.
Would you accept the premise that libertarianism does smack to some degree of a coalition ethic, that you're willing to subscribe to either party or any party that subscribes to a measure of your core views?
Depends. If you're talking about a libertarian as a philosophy, libertarians may decide to pursue different political routes. As a Libertarian Party member, the whole idea of capital L libertarianism, I am a partisan. I do think that really, as far as in the political space, the Libertarian Party in the long run is the most viable mechanism for libertarian change within the political sphere, to be conversation. But there are libertarians who operate in the Democrat Party and the Republican Party, and oftentimes their expectations, their goals, their aims are different. But I rather have people holding libertarian views in any shape or form. And the nature of our views on tolerance and coexistence do lead us to more sort of coalition tactics and be able to build much more broad coalitions.
Do you find when you speak to youthful audiences reflections of the self that you just described, individuals seeking who will gravitate to a measure of libertarian policy?
I've had fairly positive responses with youthful audiences and audiences of all ages, because at the end of the day, the libertarian message is really an appeal to who you want to be, and just saying, hey, I want you to be who you want to be, and everybody can appeal to that, appeals to their sense of self and their desire to sort of fulfill their self-identity and where they want to be. Always the question is, people's fear of each other, because people have no problem with them having the freedom to be themselves. Where they get scared of is they're scared of what happens when other people are themselves and how it might affect them. And that's why the Libertarian Party and libertarianism has to focus on hope and tolerance and whatnot, because in order to have a world where we can let each other be free, we have to not be scared of each other. And that's a very different political conversation than oftentimes the other political parties have, which is why I think the Libertarian Party is a unique vehicle, and why it has to be the vehicle that in the long run changes the conversation, because we're at a size, we're at a nimbleness now where we can kind of build a path and a message of hope and trying to reduce fear and polarization to create a world where we can just let each other be.
That's a marvelous description of where we'd like to be. We're within 15 minutes or 15 seconds, I stand corrected, of our first break. We'll be back in a moment. My name is Robert. This is Seldom Said.
This is Seldom Said with Robert Amato.
Welcome back. The program is Seldom Said. My name is Robert. Our special guest, Alex Merced, the Vice Chair of the Libertarian National Committee. Alex, I would feel that at some point in any discussion of the recent elections, it is necessary to find out the guest's feelings. What is the party's reaction and your reaction to the recent midterms?
There's quite a mixed reaction, because a lot of people, whenever you're a candidate, you always have the best expectations, because you put in a lot of work and you have to have expectations to kind of drive you to go in day in and day out, doing the hard work that is campaigning. But so there's a lot of people who didn't have results and met their expectations. But I am very optimistic, because when I take a look at the results, I have something very clear, that there was growth. In a lot of those races, we hit higher vote totals than we have in the past. We earned ballot access in states that we didn't have before. We won more offices, which is great. But the thing is that why that's important, even if it's a tiny bit of growth, why it's important that we had growth in 2018 is because a lot of people looked at 2016 and the Libertarian Party in 2016 as sort of like in the sense that, well, it was just a unique nature of that year where you had a electorate that wasn't very thrilled with both options, so looked at the Libertarian Party a little bit more than they usually would. In 2018, that dynamic was not there. It was really a election year where basically it was, I got to vote for my team so the other team doesn't win. I don't care about the other team because I need to make sure things are less worse. And the problem with that is you vote for less worse, you get less worse, which is still worse. So it's a slow slide. But the fact that we still grew even in that environment, which was not a third party favorable environment, to me is tremendous. I mean, we earned, John Uter got enough votes to earn us ballot access in Oklahoma. Larry Sharp earned us ballot access in New York, which we have never achieved in the last 46 years. So that was a huge event. Bethany Valdez in Idaho was within a few votes of beating the state Senate majority leader over there in Idaho for a state Senate, which that's huge for a third-party candidate to come in without that close. It almost looked like she won for a moment. Okay, we won. Sean Elliott, Michael Cassidy, Martha Bueno, Thomas Warfel all won seats on soil and water in Florida. Joe and Ethan Bishop Henchman, a married couple in Washington, D.C., in both their races for city council and attorney general, both outpolled the Republican candidate in their race and secured ballot access in D.C. So there's a lot of, while again, we always want more and we always want to grow faster, we are growing, and we have many things to point to for optimism and hope for the future for the Libertarian Party. It's not linear. It's not overnight. Politics is built by building the infrastructure, by building the coalitions, and taking the time to get everybody on board. And it does take time, but many of us are more and more dedicated to taking that time and making this happen.
There is a quotation attributed to the journalist Jimmy Breslin. He once said that individuals become conservative with their second mortgage. Is there any concern that libertarian ideals will be co-opted with victory?
Yeah, that's always the fear, and that's another. I mean, that's the reason why I am libertarian, because all institutions become corrupt over time. Like any institution that I like today, any institution, any party, any business, any government, anything over time, as a success, it also gravitates people who want to use that success for other ends. And over time, it becomes top-heavy. It becomes bureaucratic. And this is why institutions need to be able to rise, grow, born, and die. So right now, the Libertarian Party is young. Right now, it is nimble. It still has its integrity and isn't corrupted. But hey, if we're successful, that's great. We're going to cause a lot of change in the meantime. But down the road, that is going to attract more people who may not necessarily have the same ideals that I do, who have the same ends that I do. And at that point, when it grows and becomes top heavy and its time comes, well, new parties will sprout up, and you'll have that growth. This is the reason why you do need not just turnover at all levels, institutional turnover. And that's why I think I'm such a free market person, is because free markets allow for institutional turnover, so that way you can have fresh institutions replacing old ones that have become sort of corrupted and stale over time.
For those in the listening audience who might take the position that free markets also lend themselves to a series of oligarchies, a series of individuals and places where control is in the hands of a few, your reaction?
Oftentimes I think that doesn't look deep enough into the details of how that process becomes. Yes, maybe a lot of these oligarchies have come through enterprise, but it's not necessarily always through free enterprise. Oftentimes there is sort of a strong partnership between government and enterprise that leads to these oligarchies, where basically this partnership between enterprise, which isn't free markets, but it isn't necessarily socialism either. It's just sort of this kind of worst of all worlds, where you have this partnership that often is used to sort of keep out competition, to not allow institutional turnover, because you're not allowed, you basically create all these oligarchs, all these sort of big interests, oftentimes put barriers formally and informally in allowing sort of new entrants, those new ideas, those new institutions to come in and replace old ones. Problem is, oftentimes the answer that people propose oftentimes is just kind of freezing everything and stopping growth altogether, in a sense, saying, hey, you know what? If things don't move any further from here, then we don't run the risk of all these institutional risks. But then you don't also run into all the benefits and the upside as well. Like the phrase is more risk, more reward. But if you take out all the risk out of human interaction and human organization and human life, then you take out all the reward as well. And that's, to me, always my fear with a lot of the people who get too scared of people being free and too scared of being people having more autonomy, that they focus so hard on mitigating the risk that they accidentally mitigate all the reward.
Politics at the present time seems to be incredibly passionate. We hear quotes about when they go low, we go higher, and so forth. Mm-hmm. The primaries seem to present a contradiction in terms. You had candidates trying to be diplomatic and gentlemanly in their presentation, and then others just fervently attacking them on a very personal level. Is it going to be easy for you as a libertarian or the Libertarian Party to play that gentlemanly middle ground?
It's not going to be easy. But it's important because it's not just what you fight for, but how you fight that makes a difference. So what's happened over the last years, it's not new necessarily, but 2016 kind of was heightened, where the example of how you win was you win through polarization, you win through fear. And because that example was set, that example has been followed by everyone in every party to an extreme, where polarization has only been magnified. The only way to turn that around is to have an example of being able to win through more civility, through peace. When I ran for vice chair this year, that was my whole mantra. Basically, my campaign slogan was, let's be libertarian together. And I was very kind. I spoke kindly of my fellow opponents. I traveled and basically did my best to be as civil as possible. And I won had a fairly strong showing at the convention. So I do think it is possible. And I think there is an appetite for it right now, but it is difficult because fear plays so well. It's easy to scare people and say, you know what, the world's a scary place. That person's a scary person. So all you need to do is give me control and I'll make it all go away. That's an easy political sell. But the problem is you're asking that discourages people from having autonomy, exercising autonomy. That's why the Libertarian parties do need to have to go the approach of hope and saying, hey, you know what, the world, we believe in you. We want you to make your life better. We want to give you back the keys and give you the power to do whatever you can dream of. That's a different message. It's a harder message to sell because it's easy to be scared. But it's the right message. And if you can win a message, it'll reflect on everybody else. Everybody else will start embracing that. That's one of the positive outcomes of, in part, in Obama's win back in 2008. His message was, for the most part, positive, and you did have while you did have polarization, you did have some more positive outcomes. So even though I may have disagreed on a lot policy-wise, that tone was appreciated, even though there were times where there was divisive aspects of that election as well, but it was still a different tone. And I think an appetite for that tone, and hopefully we can serve that appetite.
Before I ask the next question, I must ask your indulgence in that my own individualism has been afflicted by allergies, and one can sense it in my voice. So the passion is there. The tone may a bit ragged, but the sincerity, I'm hoping, is applied. If we talk about this idea of passion and how to apply it and how to use it, do you feel that there is a base out there in this nation of ours where people are prepared to be totally individualistic?
People always are struggling in the conflict between several different priorities, values, and whatnot. Many may not prioritize or value individualism as highly as I do, but a libertarian world doesn't necessarily need everyone to value that as much. People can operate collectively and organize in a libertarian world. We just want to let everybody be free to pursue the values that they have and coexist. That's literally what as a libertarian, I'm asking for. I'm not asking everyone to have my values, to have my views. I'm just asking for us to all sort of, as an individual, disarm and allow each other to coexist. And yeah, that might conflict. That does here and there conflict with values, but over time, if you put that message out there, we can have a very pluralistic, you could have that liberalism exist in a much grander scale than it does now, to everyone's benefit. And I do think a country like America, where within sort of its folklore, within its history, within its every aspect of its sort of cultural meme, has a lot of those aspects sort of sewn into it. So there is sort of a prime, sort of a primer you get just by being enculturated within Americana, in a sense.
There is a kind of Walt Whitman type affectation with this idea that people are by nature good and capable of superior motives and actions. Do you feel there is that reservoir of goodwill out there that has not been bastardized by change that can be employed and directed to a common goal?
I do believe that people are generally good. A book that I loved that kind of helped enhance this opinion for me is a book called The Moral Molecule, where they actually looked at sort of releases of oxytocin and how this affects people's behavior. And it actually kind of really showed me that we're like really wired to cooperate. We're wired to be to respect each other. It's just sometimes things go wrong that can affect that. And that's a book I highly recommend. But I do think most people, by and large, are good. And I think if we encourage things, and this is where I say, I grew up Catholic, even though I don't necessarily practice now, things like tolerance, forgiveness, which is not necessarily part of, core to sort of libertarian philosophy, which is just basically a philosophy of nonviolence, of peace, of non-aggression. But things like tolerance and forgiveness and whatnot are values that do help foster an environment where we can coexist and you can have that better will and autonomy towards others. So to me, focusing on promoting that kind of just goodness as an individual can help move us in that direction and build that coalition of good people.
Someone had posited the question to me that ultimately something like total freedom is going to run into the reality of nature and man. There was one position taken by the Libertarian Party in regard to the acceptance of gay marriages. The individual I spoke to, the individuals in plural, because many agreed with them, felt that this was a positive step. They all espoused the belief that any man or woman should have the right to pursue their own lifestyle in their own way. And yet the libertarian position in regard to gun control seemed to them contraindicated. There was a contradiction in their mind preventing them from embracing the libertarian ethic by the fact that you had these two contraindicated positions. How do you respond to the idea that total freedom means the possibility of infringing on the freedom of others?
Basically, when people kind of go in that direction where they sit there and say, well, if we take your ideas to the absolute extreme, it may not be so pretty, I go, well, just because you may be scared of the absolute extreme doesn't necessarily mean we don't have more that we need to travel now. Like, doesn't mean we're as far as we can go yet. So, for example, losing too much weight may be unhealthy, but it doesn't necessarily mean you've lost as much weight as you should yet. So if I can at least get people to realize that maybe that's the direction we should be going in, even if we can't agree on how far we should go in that direction, we can at least move in the right direction. And we'll part ways when we must part ways. But I generally believe more autonomy is better. And I do think total freedom, more, or at least closer to total freedom, oftentimes will yield better benefits and less risk, because it's not just the options people change, people's incentives change, people's perceptions of risks and rewards and the level of responsibility that they have to undertake change. And there's for example, there's actually a really interesting piece that I saw. I think this was from a show on Vice, or Vox, where basically they looked at this prison in Europe, where the prison in Europe, what it does is that instead of like punishing you and just jailing you and basically giving you no freedom, it actually kind of creates a little free world within that where you can kind of learn to operate within society. That level of freedom actually led to less recidivism, because when people are expected to learn to coexist, they'll rise to that responsibility. The more you expect people to not be responsible for X, Y, and Z, it just kind of creates a self-fulfilling cultural meme, and that's kind of the same thing we were seeing in the prison system. So while this piece that I was watching wasn't necessarily from a libertarian angle, I could see sort of a grander libertarian takeaway in the sense that the way we model our world has a great effect on the way people behave going forward, and whether they react to the chains that bind them or rise to the freedom that they have. And that's kind of what we saw in these differences between how you handle incarceration versus giving people sort of more freedom and using it less more of what's the word I'm looking for? More rehabilitation than punishment.
You then ascribe to the fact or the premise that rehabilitation is more positive than punishment, more effective, and more indeed possible. Yes,
agreed. I think I'm generally always for rehabilitation over punishment, because the benefits are greater. I mean, having more people on board who can coexist creates all sorts of economies of scale that are to all our benefits, that create more avenues, more opportunities, more benefits to everyone, versus the cost of punishment. The cost of punishment, the effects it has on individual behavior, as far as basically, recidivant rates generally don't respond well to just straight up punishment. Also, the psychology aspects of it. It just always seems that when you give people the benefit of the doubt, you're more likely to get a positive result than not. Doesn't mean you always will, but I'm generally a believer in second chances and third chances.
That's a nice way to end our second segment. I tend to subscribe to that feeling myself, although I've encountered circumstance where there is not a quintessential evil, but there is something wrong that needs to be corrected. We'll pursue this line of thought in a few seconds. The program is Seldom Said. My name is Robert.
This is Seldom Said with Robert Amato.
Welcome back to our last segment. It's the sign that I've found ostensibly of a good program when it's gone so very quickly, and this indeed is one. Alex, perhaps it's time to talk about specific issues and how they're reflective on the policy of the Libertarian Party. In regard to, for instance, immigration, can you espouse the position of the party?
We're generally always for moving more to a world of more travel and basically lower burdens. So basically, I think we reinforced that in our platform. We made a change to our platform this year that basically opened the door to even a more stronger sentiment towards that sort of more free travel, free movement. I would say most libertarians are open borders, not all libertarians, but most of them are at least close to that. We generally, because again, if you want market free people, you need free trade. Just the exchange of ideas, the competition with people with their feet, all these things create positive accountability in the world. I understand the fears that people have over. Again, this is always the issue when you talk about free trade, free travel, free markets, free anything. People are always scared of what people do. Freedom, scared of what the consequences are. But it doesn't necessarily mean we don't have more in that direction that we can go. I definitely think, to me, immigration is very personal because I'm a son of an immigrant from Guatemala. And basically a lot of what's happened in Central America heavily affected my mom's growing up, which affected sort of my upbringing. And all that, when I dealt with my grandmother talking about sort of regime change in the 50s and et cetera. So the way I look at immigration is the way I look at any kind of prohibition. So basically, when you make something illegal or you make something hard to get, you form black markets. So when we talk about illegal immigration is essentially a black market for immigration, and it has all the characteristics of a black market, where you have where you're dealing with sort of criminal organizations to procure the service. There's more violence involved, every aspect, and then also more harm done to people on both sides of the issue because of those black markets. And generally, the solution, the way you fix a black market, is by getting rid of the need for it, by making it legal. Whether it's marijuana, making it legal, whether it's immigration and making it much easier to immigrate, so that way there is no need for a black market for immigration. These are the things we can get rid of those and do a lot of harm reduction. So I'm generally always kind of wanting to move away from prohibition in black markets, and that's how I feel about immigration. That's how I feel about recreational substances or medicinal substances or any substance, and also how I feel about guns.
With the supposed caravan approaching the Texas border, what do you feel a libertarian president's position would be then?
There was one Libertarian Party member from New Hampshire who put out a suggestion of having sort of a U.S. naval ship go to the coast, so that way they can begin the process of doing the asylum application with a lot less hoopla, because basically you can bring the caravan onto the ship. They're not necessarily on mainland U.S. soil, but you can still kind of speak to them, see what the situations are, see who meet the asylum guidelines, the paperwork, and process everything effectively at much less political cost, at much less controversy on either side. So that's a possibility if there was a libertarian president to take that approach, to sit there and say, hey, let's figure out what's sort of the in-between. How can we follow the process that we have, yet be cognizant of, the number of people, the dire straits that they may be in, but the fact that, there's a process and we need to adhere to that process. So I thought that was a decent suggestion from an LP member.
You've mentioned on a personal level your own background. Guatemala had its history of difficulties in the 60s, Tupamaru, and so forth. Are you then an advocate of granted asylum for those in danger and in need?
Yeah, I'm just all for just letting people travel where they want to go. As long as you're not passing, you don't have any clinical diseases, and you pass a background check. I'm generally for letting people kind of travel where they want to go, whether it's for asylum, for opportunity, or for leisure. Motives to me shouldn't be the determinant of whether people have the right to do something. And that's where I think libertarians differ on a lot of issues, where a lot of people sit there and say, well, we should make it illegal if people are using it for kind of like the whole medicinal marijuana argument. Well, libertarians are more like, motives doesn't matter. You have rights. And the fact that your motive may be different than another doesn't necessarily change that you have that right.
Returning to that issue of gun control, and it seems almost a circular argument, the parents in the recent shooting who wept aloud during her broadcasts and simply said she was tired of prayers, she was tired of good feelings, she wanted control. How, again, can we reinforce this libertarian idea of every man, not so much for himself, but for his own ethic, and the fact that people are killing each other in mass? This last shooting was the worst shooting in 2 weeks. It's an incredible thing to get your mind around.
Yeah, this is an epidemic, and this is a problem that does need sober conversations, and it goes just beyond the issue. It goes beyond mental health, also goes just around the culture at the moment. All these things that are going to affect whether there's more violent situations, not just gun situations, but more violent situations where people are losing their lives en masse. And I do think there's a lot of levels where that happens. Now, for the first part, a lot of people always they want more control because they want more certainty, which is a very understandable desire to sit there and say, hey, you know what? I'm tired of unpredictableness, especially when that unpredictableness could mean the loss of my family, the loss of people that I care about, the loss of my job. I understand people's fear of uncertainty. The problem is the more you try to control uncertainty, oftentimes the result is you create more of it. So oftentimes there is a leap of faith that has to happen where you have to realize that the only certainty in life is uncertainty. But again, that aspect that if you control it, you'll oftentimes create more of it. But on the gun issue, a couple of things to say why I'm not against people taking steps to secure the areas. Again, the libertarian isn't saying, hey, there shouldn't be nothing done about guns. The question is, who does it? How is it enforced? Who makes those decisions? We oftentimes don't want people, wholesale, one-size-fits-all solutions. So, for example, a federal government solution, what's on each state is very different. What's going on in each county is very different. What's going on in each very town is different. So when you have much more grand-scale solutions, you oftentimes lose sight of a lot of those micro differences. But at the same time, when the government's the one creating the solution, that solution has to be imposed, and that has its own consequences as well. It doesn't necessarily mean there aren't solutions. So I just want to put that out there, that I'm not saying that there isn't any solution, that you can't have a discussion about guns. The question is sort of what levers are you using? But my fear is when you start going towards the prohibition direction, which is where a lot of people want to go, and either making it harder to get guns or making you unable to get guns, you will end up with black markets, which are less transparent. If you want if you want law enforcement to be able to track and prevent the next gun crime, you're going to want them to have some aspect to be able to issue a warrant to a gun store and whatnot. But if they're not available at all, or so unavailable that people have to go into black markets, then it becomes much harder to track where they're going and much harder to predict where the next event may be or to trace why it may happen. You have a lack of transparency, which is the same thing you see in drug black markets, in immigration black markets. You lose track of the problem. So you've just made the problem worse because you've made it less transparent. So I'm not saying again, I'm not saying that there isn't harm that we can try to find ways to reduce, but I always fear the other consequences that happen when you start moving towards a more prohibition, black market direction.
If we carry that idea to its ultimate, there is the current controversy as to whether reporters are seeking the truth or their own partisan reflections. How much truth do you feel in a libertarian-oriented government the average citizen should have? Complete, unobtrusive?
You mean like in the sense where they should have access to sort of all information and complete like government transparency, or that elaborate a little bit more on sort of where we're going with this question?
Certainly. I'm thinking of a number of historical examples. The day after Pearl Harbor, the New York Times had an editorial in which they said, "We've struck them, we've gotten even," and we were nowhere near getting even. We were at the bottom of Pearl Harbor. Other people might take the position that gun control is feasible, that an armed person inside a store can prevent takeover and loss of life from a person entering the store with a weapon. Do you feel that a total honest approach and an acceptance of rationality is in everyone's interest?
Yeah. I mean, in a sense that everyone should be able to voice all arguments in the debate, be able to seek as much evidence as they want to make their appeals, because it's how we get, it's all, at the end of the day, nothing changes without, even if it doesn't have to be implicit consent through legislation, but even if it's informal consent by the way we change our actions and behaviors in our everyday lives, that happens through our interaction and discussion. So I do think people should be encouraged to seek truth, to seek information, seek data, refine their arguments, interact with each other, and not necessarily get heightened or shut conversations with each other down, because we can get closer to those levels of consensus, again, informal, formal or informal, that'll create change that can make things better. So just having the conversation about gun acts, violent acts, the economy, about all this stuff, not only may affect policy, but on a grander scale will affect the actions we take in our own lives that also have an effect on mitigating these situations and mitigating all sorts of problems that we talk about in all of policy areas. So more truth, discussion, more deliberation is always good.
We're within 6.5 minutes of the end of what has proven to be a finely interesting program. So I'll just throw out examples of issues, and if you might perhaps then respond in the manner of a libertarian as to what you feel the solutions are. The drug crisis that we're losing, what has been the libertarian position?
Like the drug crisis as far as like opioid addiction. At the end of the day, moving away from prohibition always is going to be the most harm reduction. I do think sort of the mid-step that a lot of people are taking is still at least a step in the right direction, where you're seeing things like injection sites and sort of trying to make more steps in harm reduction or harm reduction. But to me, I think moving away from prohibition would actually reduce harm, because you can have much more quality control when things are through transparent buyers and sellers. You can monitor the extent at which the problem exists, because people can do it out openly. And then it's much easier to reach out to those people to mitigate the problem. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean there is no con, there's no growing pains. I mean, even when you had, I think, when you ended alcohol prohibition, in the short run, I think there was a slight increase in use in the short run that tapered off and went and reversed in the other direction in the long run. And I think we'll probably see, the same thing in Portugal with some of their decriminalization efforts and whatnot. So from the evidence of moving away from prohibition historically, it always just seems that seems to work pretty well.
I'm referring to a number of the issues raised by potential audience members that were posited to me, and it was presupposed that I would ask them of you, if you do not mind. Marvelous. I appreciate the openness. Physician-assisted suicide. From
my point of view, if your body is your property, and I think this is generally the libertarian view, because we're all about self-ownership. Basically, our views of individual peace and sort of non-violence comes from the idea of self-ownership, where your body is yours, the fruits of your labor are yours. So your life is yours. no one else has a right to take your life, but if you want your life taken, you have a right to take it. And I know at the end of the day, if someone close to me was in a position like that, well, that would, of course, emotionally distress me, and I can feel that pain of somebody losing somebody. And I've lost people who I care about quite deeply, but at the end of the day, we do believe that your body is your property. If that's the decision you want to make, that is your decision to make.
It is, of course, very difficult to have a judgment of comparative values or dangers and issues. If you were to choose the top 2 issues that you feel are afflicting American society today, Alex, what might they, in your opinion, be?
I think it's just a general, right now the country or the world in a lot of ways is going through just sort of a growing pain. I mean, the amount of information, the amount of ideas that the world has had access to is growing faster than ever, and people are being exposed to more and more variety of ideas than ever before, which is a good thing. But I don't think the world has necessarily adjusted to that reality yet, which has created polarization in every issue. So to me, just sort of that natural acclimation to this sort of acceleration of information will create some more stability in the long run. But to me, of course, I think free markets go a long way, and free markets it doesn't always have to be taken to its extreme. I take it to its extreme, but others don't have to. But the idea is moving towards a world of more free markets can improve a lot of economic outcomes that also improves psychological outcomes, which improves which improves criminal justice outcomes, which can, and then also could also have foreign policy outcomes, because more wealthy countries around the world, which the wealthier you are, the less you necessarily want to get into sort of to physical altercations, in a sense. You're less you're going to end up more afraid of bombs and all sorts of things. So countries who trade each other oftentimes don't bomb each other. So I do want more trade, more markets. I think that has benefits all across all issues. But that's really, at the end of the day, at its core, just means free people. But prohibition and markets are probably areas where I'm most focused. And then third would probably be sort of foreign policy and having a more peace-based policy stance than sort of a more aggressive policy stance.
Alex, if I may, I'm loath to interrupt your comments, which are arresting and interesting. We have a few seconds, a minute and a half. Can you tell those listeners in the audience who have been taken with your ideas and ideals how they might become involved in party activities?
Please go to lp.org/join. And actually, if you go this week, we're doing a special sort of Spirit Week. It's called the We the People Week. If you go to lp.org/We the People and you become a member, you actually get a cool little card. And then you guys can always follow me on Twitter @AlexSaid. I'm always trying to put out ideas and have civil conversations. So if anyone wants to engage with me on any of these issues and just kind of have a back and forth and not necessarily change each other, but at least understand each other better, I'm more than welcome to that engagement. And hopefully I'll see you guys within Libertarian Party events if you found what I had to say persuasive enough.
Will we walk into a store at some point in time and find a book with your name and authorship?
Hopefully someday. Hopefully, it's definitely one of the things I am and would like to work on, among many other things. But there are podcasts, hopefully someday, and several other items that you'll find my name on. So do Google me.
We most certainly will. This has been an informative and obviously interesting hour. There are a lot of changes the country is ready for. One hopes they'll be receptive to some of the ideas that our guest today espoused. My name is Robert. This is Seldom Said. See you next time.